Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Stacey Hall, Interim Director of the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security, commonly known as NCS4 at the University of Southern Mississippi in the United States. We are the nation's only academic center devoted to the study and practice of spectator sports safety and security. Since the NCS4's inception, we have served as a critical resource center for industry leaders worldwide through our training and educational programs, interdisciplinary research, and professional outreach activities. It is an honor to partner with the Embassy of Qatar in Washington, D.C. to deliver today's webinar. These are unprecedented times for the sports industry. We as a sports community appreciate the role sports play in our society and the significant impact sports and special events have on our local, state, and national economies. On a weekly, if not daily basis, we learn of sports leagues and events being cancelled, postponed, concluded early, resumed at a reduced capacity, or have been returned to business behind closed doors. With some of the world's mega events on the horizon, such as the Tokyo Olympics in 2021 and the FIFA World Cup in 2022, hosted by our friends in Qatar, there is no better time to pause, evaluate the impact COVID has had on spectator sports, review lessons learned from leagues and events that have returned to some form of operations, and discuss the implications and strategies for stakeholders involved in the planning and hosting of future events. Now is the time to assess and validate new protocols and technological solutions. Today's moderator and panelists possess a unique blend of expertise. Professional expertise in executive leadership, team management, stadium development, legacy building, and security resiliency, as well as academic and research expertise in security and crime science, emerging diseases, and sustainable health systems. Today's dialogue promises to be engaging and forward-thinking as we consider the future of sports events and the safety of all involved. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. And at this time, I will hand it over to our moderator, Mr. Oliver Luck.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. I appreciate the introduction, and let me welcome all of our listeners from across the globe. Let me first introduce our panelists that will share their expertise with you today. Our CEO for the International Center for Sports Security, Mr. Massimiliano Montanari, welcome. Next, the Chief Operating Officer for the National Security and Resilience Program, as well as a Security Committee member on the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, Major Mohammed Al-Ida. Dr. Justin Kurland, Director of Research at the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security. And finally, Dr. Erin M. Sorrell. She's an assistant professor at the Center for Global Health, Science, and Security at Georgetown University Medical Center. Let me, Dr. Sorrell, ask you to give our listeners a brief overview of the COVID situation across the globe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Oliver, and thank you so much to the organizers for this wonderful and very important event. I'm sure everyone participating today is very familiar with the ongoing pandemic, but I thought it would be helpful to think about where we came from and where we are. So the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the COVID-19 pandemic, is a member of the larger coronavirus family. There are a number of viruses that are actually endemic and responsible for what we consider a common cold that happens seasonally and are part of the coronavirus family. However, in 2002 and 2012, there were emerging coronaviruses that led to the SARS epidemic and the MERS epidemic. So SARS-CoV-2 is the third novel emerging coronavirus that we have had in the last 2 decades lead to epidemic and pandemic disorder from an emerging infectious disease from the coronavirus family. It was late in December that the country office in China reported to WHO an abnormal amount of cases of some pneumonia due to unknown causes. Within 30 days, we not only had the virus isolated in sequence, diagnostic tests available and shared through the WHO network. We had the first cases of deaths reported in China. We had, within 2 weeks, international transmission and reporting of cases in the Southeast Asia region. And within 30 days of the first reporting, we had global spread of this virus to 5 of the 6 WHO regions, resulting in WHO declaring this not only a pandemic, but a public health emergency of international concern under the international health regulations. I think one of the important things to consider here is the timing of this outbreak occurring during the Spring Festival in China. This is one of the largest, if not the largest, planned human migration that happens on an annual basis. We have 3 billion people estimated to travel, not only within China, but through the region for holiday, to visit family. And so the timing of this outbreak coinciding with this very large migration event really led to very quick, very rapid global spread of this disease. We are very much still in the first wave of this pandemic. The rough estimates from Johns Hopkins COVID tracking report that I pulled this morning indicate over 20.5 million cases worldwide, with over 750,000 deaths. In the 8 months that we've had to study this virus, we've developed various treatments, various diagnostics, and are making major headway with vaccine development, with over 150 vaccines either in phase 1 through phase 3 clinical trials. So there is a lot that we've learned in the last 8 months and a lot more to learn. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversations today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sorrell. I think, as everybody knows, the COVID-19 has wreaked real havoc on the world of sports, just like it has in all sectors of society. Sports organizations, be they professional organizations, be they amateur organizations, have announced, as you mentioned, thousands, perhaps millions of postponements, cancellations, whether those are games or tournaments or practices. But just in the last month or so, the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've begun to see a resumption, a revival of sporting competition. We've seen baseball in Korea and elsewhere in Asia start their seasons up again. We've seen soccer, football, of course, for most of the world in Europe, including the Champions League, begin competitions. Basketball in China is in the middle of their playoffs. Just recently, the Brazilian domestic league started to play football as well. And of course, this has typically been without spectators in the stands. There's one, I think, sort of interesting development I would like to touch on, which is a concept that has worked fairly well here in the United States, and it's the so-called bubble concept. The idea that you can bring your important participants, the players, the coaches, the game officials, a relatively limited number of individuals, and put them into a somewhat hermetically sealed bubble. The NBA did this, the National Basketball Association. In fact, they're still playing games in their bubble successfully. The WNBA, the women's version of the NBA, has done this as well. Major League Soccer, MLS, went through about a 3-week bubble. In fact, all of those were in Orlando. They worked with the Disney company for hotels and restaurants and all that. The National Women's Soccer League here in the US had a successful bubble concept as well. So that concept is challenging because, again, the immediate participants, players, coaches, game officials, really are leading a very cloistered life, if one could say that, with basically the hotel and the practice facility, game facility being the two places that they toggle back and forth. Again, hermetically sealed, minimizing, if not eliminating contact with anybody in the outside world, including their own families, their kids and spouses and friends. It's worked well, even if occasionally the bubble with the various leagues has been punctured, but it's been a very successful concept. And I would like, Major Aida, I'd like to turn to you with the success of those bubbles and knowing how difficult they are to construct and to operationalize. Is it even conceivable that a tournament like the World Cup, one of the most, if not the most important sporting event on the global calendar, is it conceivable that a bubble concept could work with the World Cup, Major?
Yeah, Oliver, first of all, thank you for having me today and give me this opportunity to share our experience and significant issue. Honestly, the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022 is still over 2 years away. And no one knows how long this pandemic will last. But we are optimistic, as always. We are optimistic that the tournament will not be affected. Qatar has been constantly ranked as on the safest countries in the Arab region for several years. And the most recent ranking places Qatar as the 7th safest country globally. And Qatar has a history of organizing major successful events with the highest safety and security standard. Our security plans are prepared in partnership with the leading organizations, including FIFA, Interpol, the FBI, and the International Center for Sports Security. Going back to the question about sealing World Cup venues, we are very optimistic that this global crisis will dissipate before 2022. And the organizing committee is always discussing with the relevant authorities, including the World Health Organization, Qatar's Ministry of Public Health, and FIFA to prepare plans if the pandemic continues.
Thank you, Major. We would all like to share your optimism about getting control of the COVID, but we very much appreciate that. If I could, let me shift the attention just a bit away from COVID and the repercussions of this virus and talk about some of the more traditional safety concerns that exist with any large sporting event. And Mr. Montanari, I'll turn my attention to you. Is there any concern from you that the 22 World Cup, again, one of the most, if not the most important sporting event in the calendar, could have any safety concerns? It is, to be fair, the first World Cup to be held in the Middle East, the first World Cup to be held in a majority Muslim country. But Mr. Montanari, from your perspective, do you lose any sleep at night over some of those concerns that exist with this particular World Cup and any World Cup really in the past as well?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. No, I would say that I continue to sleep well. I believe that when a country decides to host a major sporting event like a World Cup or like an Olympic game, and particularly a country like Qatar that has actually started hosting events of an international dimension almost 20 years ago. I believe that there is a certain degree of awareness of the type of challenge that the country will have to cope with. So I think that when you go for that decision, you have then to move forward with all the determination. So it's like if you are a doctor and it's time, to start a complex surgery, then there is no time to be, to look at back, and to say, okay, I did the right thing or that. So when you start, I think you have to move forward with all the determination, bearing in mind that from a technical viewpoint, the topics nowadays of safety, security are quite well covered by instruments which have been developed by the international community. So we have today, solid conventions on the safety and security of major sporting events that was produced within the framework of the Council of Europe. We have platforms that has been developed by the United Nations, by Interpol, resolution on the protection of vulnerable targets, guidelines produced by sport bodies, and obviously the work of the World Health Organization with regard to the health and of course the COVID consideration. Certainly there are, let's say, new threats or emerging threats that should be looked at with special attention or with some special concerns, including, let's say, those new vulnerabilities that has been, created by COVID-19. We we hosted a couple of weeks ago, within the framework of our cooperation with the UN Office of Counterterrorism and UNICRE, a similar discussion like the one we are having today, but specifically to discuss on how COVID-19 is having an impact on the security of major sporting events. Within the framework of a program which is supported by the state of Qatar and other countries, member states of the United Nations. And one of, for instance, of the experts that was with us in the event, actually one of the experts from the Supreme Committee for Delivery Legacy, talk about the threat and the risk of far-right extremism, talking of course about the general situation, not about Qatar specifically, but as one of the main, let's say, new, let's say, threats to major sporting events, because far-right extremism is often associated with the football legalism, and these has become become much more active during the pandemic. But also there is, I see the need, for instance, to preserve, for instance, now perhaps more than in other circumstances, cyber security in a world which during the pandemic has become more and more dependent on technology. But look, if you allow me maybe to add another, let's say, consideration, perhaps of more general nature, my main concern, to be honest, is not about, let's say, specific safety or security issues, but looking at the COVID scenario or the post-COVID scenario, I think that my main concern is to see sometimes the difficulty at the policy level and internationally to develop a real, let's say, an holistic approach to address global threats to major sporting events. Utilizing an approach grounded on effective coordination, but so in particular on the principle that common global interest should come before local or sectorial considerations. So I'm trying to refer to the capacity that we should have to, on one side, to think globally and act locally, but also to the capacity to act locally without forgetting the impact that local action can have on the common and global, let's say, interest. So I sometimes struggle to see in some, let's say, ongoing international debates that attention, you know, on the global challenges and on the very long-term perspective. Of course, the protection of events like Tokyo Olympics, Qatar, it's of course it's eminent, you know, because they are the next big events that will take place. But I think that we need to make an effort to think in longer terms, looking at how the world is going to be in the next 10 years, and also at the same time looking at not just on how the world of sport will protect itself, but also how the world of sport will contribute to the protection of society at large.
Right.
With the last consideration on this, when at the beginning of the pandemic, for instance, when it moved to Europe, and when actually people were already dying in certain countries in Europe, other countries at very short distance were still hosting international competitions in very crowded stadia. At the same time, while WHO was urging people to stay at home, other people in leadership positions were still calling to have events. You know? So I think that we need to be more probably coordinated in the very long term, bearing in mind that certainly we are now prepared for the resumption of certain games, adopting all the necessary measures that are currently, let's say, under implementation or in phase of testing.
Yes, thank you. Let me pick up on a point that you raised, but before I do that, let me share with all of our listeners that you can use the Q&A button to send a question, and we'll have a section at the end of this presentation to answer some of those questions. But let me pick up on something that you mentioned. I'll ask Dr. Kurland to begin to weigh in on this. You mentioned, Mr. Montanari, about far-right extremism. So if you go back to the most recent World Cup in Russia in 2018, there was some anxiety, as there is with every World Cup because it's such a high-profile event, but there was some anxiety about far-right extremism in Russia. And by all accounts, that was a very successful tournament. Some folks believe that the use of technology was very helpful in terms of spectator security. Fan ID is the sort of the brand, if you will, that is being used. And in fact, UEFA, the European Confederation, was planning to use it as well for their European championships. But Dr. Kurland, from your perspective, what did we learn from Russia 2018, and how can technology, including perhaps facial recognition technology, how can technology give us a safe and secure environment for these mega events like the World Cup?
Sure. Before I get started, I just want to briefly thank the host for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic as we move closer and closer to the World Cup, in combination with obviously this global pandemic that's going on that needs to be addressed. So without steering too off course, I just want to circle back and reiterate. I think Mr. Luck, you made a great point about the fact that historically World Cups tend to attract this kind of media coverage where there's this fear that there will always be this kind of underlying hooliganism and sense of far-right nationalism that bubbles up. It's been there at pretty much every World Cup. But to tie it directly to the question at hand as it relates to kind of technologies, emerging technologies, and the use of fan ID during the last World Cup, I think there's a long history in the sport of football dating back to the post-Hillsborough period in the UK about the use of fan ID schemes. Originally in the UK, there was a lot of pushback in the early 1990s when the idea of fan IDs became a prevalent way to try to think about trying to control spectators. And it was never adopted in the UK. Interestingly, kind of over the course of the last kind of 20, 25 years or so, different nations have started to implement different kinds of schemes. Most recently, in Turkey, I conducted a study with a colleague of mine in Istanbul and one of the important issues about that we covered in that particular research was about spectators' perceptions of the use of fan ID. Now, the perception in this one domestic context in Turkey may not necessarily be reflective of the broader supporter and spectator community across the world, but importantly, it gives us some indication of spectators' willingness or desire to be involved with the schemes. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's never been any study that's actually taken a close look at the fan ID concept as it relates to how they interface with security. So while the numbers may match up in a particularly good way, there may be some correlation, but it's not necessarily causal. So because there was a decrease in a certain number of incidents doesn't necessarily mean that stemmed from this particular ID. It could have been other technologies that were being utilized. But I think moving ahead and thinking about what's going to be happening in relation to the upcoming World Cup, and Major, I think that your attitude and the Qataris' attitude towards thinking about what's going to happen in 2 years is fantastic. I'm right there with you. I want to believe that by the time we get to the World Cup, things will be better. But there is this expression, hope for the best, but expect and plan for the worst. And so in anticipation of that, there are a lot of kind of technologies that are emerging to try to deal with some of the issues related to COVID, particularly as it relates to sports. So Mr. Luck, you mentioned face coverings. This becomes an interesting, challenging for because of facial recognition technology's reliance on the ability to see an entire face. If we're still dealing with COVID, it eliminates the possibility to utilize facial recognition technology. So this is the kind of thing that we need to consider when we're making decisions as it relates to safety and security in the present and moving forward. Are these technologies going to be sustainable in the context for things such as a global pandemic? So then you've got these other kind of emerging technologies that are meant for safety and security. related to thermal imaging and infrared temperature. That is certainly something that looks from the outside as promising. Dr. Sorrell, who will speak after me, I believe, can probably speak more intelligently as to her feelings as it relates to these as a technology. But I do know that in preparation for thinking about this upcoming World Cup, I think it's really critical that we get this right, and we figure out whether or not these technologies can be used, and if they can be used, if they're going to have the capacity, if we're going to have a World Cup where there are spectators that are present, if they have the capacity to push people through and get them into stadiums and into fan zones in a way that doesn't cause other safety and security challenges. So I hope that's answered your question, and I'll return the mic to you, Mr. Love. Thank you.
No, that was an excellent response. And, you know, spectators are obviously so important for the success of a massive sporting event. I think back to the World Cup in Germany back earlier this century, and they had the so-called Sommermärchen, the summer fantasy, because the sheer number of people celebrating sport, celebrating camaraderie, celebrating sort of the beauty of this great game and this great tournament. And it'd be a shame if we weren't able to do that. But speaking of that, let me bring Dr. Sorrell back in. Doctor, as a medical professional and as a professor, what sort of protocols do you think would be appropriate for checking spectators for? Is it temperature checks? Is it perhaps a vaccine that's available, masks that would be available? What level of concern should there be in terms of even in this 2022, hopefully post-COVID world? How careful do we need to be to not allow an event, a game, a match to become a so-called super spreader? Mr. Montanari mentioned that, and that I guess the scientists can go back to Italy to one of the Serie A games that was a so-called super spreader. How careful, Dr. Sorrell, do we need to be with an event like the World Cup?
It's an important question to consider, not just in the context of COVID-19, but in public health in general. So we think about mass gathering events, there will always be some type of public health priority or public health event that needs attention and response. So I think it's a matter of, Dr. and Mr. Montanari included this in his comments about an interdisciplinary approach to COVID-19 and to safety and security around events like the World Cup, is to think about, from a logistical perspective, how best to provide care to those that need it, how to conduct effective and responsive surveillance, whether it is to an infectious disease like COVID or to something like dehydration, right, of fans and participants. So I think it has to be a general public health approach that could potentially involve diagnostic capabilities that we don't have currently, that will be developed in the next year. Thermal scanning has been shown to be somewhat effective, but can be challenging depending on the environment that you're conducting scanning in and outside, inside temperatures of participants as they go through scanning. And it's hit or miss with particularly COVID-19, whether or not you're actually feverish at the highest point of infectivity, where you're the most likely to transmit the virus. One of the big challenges with COVID right now is we're seeing the role of asymptomatic patients in spreading the virus. So these are people who do not show any type of clinical symptoms of infection, but are very effective in spreading the virus. So I think one of the key aspects will be looking at point of care diagnostics, meaning there are tests that we can run on site with very rapid response to understand whether or not people are exposed and infected. And that can help with a very quick response, tracing of potential contacts, et cetera. But I think to address your question, I hope that there will be investments in technology that will allow us to be as responsive as possible in 2022, and vaccines available that can be provided across the globe for consumption, so that not only players and members of teams, but the general community that would be participating in this event would have access to it and have some protection against that particular virus.
Thank you, Dr. Sorrell. So let me go back to Major Alida. Mr. Montanari mentioned that it's important to have a holistic approach, and I think we would probably all agree with that. You mentioned, Mr. Montanari, the idea of acting locally but thinking globally. Major, historically going back to the first World Cup tournament in Montevideo, Uruguay in 1930, the tournaments have been remarkably free of sort of geopolitical unrest. There have only been a handful of teams that have boycotted for various reasons the tournament, and occasionally there was a country that was prohibited from participating, like South Africa during apartheid. I suppose my question, Major, is this. Given the potential of the virus to flare up in various countries, we're witnessing that now, I think the United States and Brazil, Mexico, all relatively important soccer nations, football nations, are having very, very, very serious difficulties with the virus. Is it possible, I suppose, that a nation may not be able to participate in the tournament because of the flare-up of the virus, due to sort of trying to think holistically and globally about the security and safety of not just players, but spectators and others as well?
Actually, we have our process, and which is coordinate with the WHO and also the public health in Qatar. And first of all, Qatar is ready to welcome everyone, regardless of their nationalities, political views, and background. And the COVID-19 is a global problem we have not seen before in our lifetime. It has affected everyone. So travel restrictions are an issue too for governments around the world. But we are watching the situation closely. If the pandemic continues, we will work hard to make sure that all possible measures are in place to make sure fans, players, and officials are kept healthy and safe. And we will continue to work closely with our government and take advice from WHO and FIFA. But we are confident that the decisions that will be made will be based on the advice recommended by leading experts.
Thank you. So, traditionally, those nations that host the World Cup will host a significant tournament, more or less a year out. And, it could be called a dry run. It could be called a dress rehearsal. So in December of 2021, the plan is for a Pan-Arab tournament to take place in the beautiful new venues that have been constructed throughout the country. So I would be curious, Dr. Kurland, is this the appropriate time to test all protocols, whether they be COVID related or sort of more traditional fan and security protocols in terms of safety? Is the Pan-Arab tournament 1 year out from the World Cup the appropriate time, Dr. Kurland, to test all of those protocols?
I would say the sooner we start testing various protocols in relation to the return to sport more generally, the better off, so that by the time December 2021 comes around, we already have a lot of information available to us to help make as informed a decision based on evidence as possible. So, it's not really clear at the moment what's happening with all the leagues. We had a discussion earlier on about the use of the bubble. I'm not sure what's happening more broadly as it relates to sports. I think obviously a year out provides certainly a good opportunity to but hopefully to carry on some of the work that's done over the next year to year and a half as it relates to trying to figure out which technologies are most useful, which protocols make the most sense, but what can be done as it relates to filling stadiums with spectators in the safest and most secure way possible. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, I think we certainly should be putting protocols in place that will be utilized during the World Cup. But no, I think we should start sooner. I think that the sooner that we start, the more information we'll have to make better, more informed decisions for both the tournament that's a year out, the Pan Arab games, and then for the actual World Cup in the worst case scenario that COVID still exists.
Dr. Sorrell, I assume that you would agree with Dr. Kurland that the Pan Arab tournament 1 year out, December of 2019, would also be the appropriate time for any medical protocols to be not just put in place, but practiced throughout the course of that tournament.
Absolutely. As Dr. Kurland mentioned, thinking about, I like to joke that a lot of times we do lessons observed versus lessons learned. So we write after action reviews, we publish papers, and we talk about what went wrong. I think now is the time to collect that data and to use it to inform how we approach things in the next year. If we do that, we have, as Dr. Kurland mentioned, an evidence-based approach to approach the Pan Arab Games and then to inform the World Cup. So it's all about preparation, testing, and revising. And having a year in between the two major events allows us to not only analyze the information collected during the Pan Arab event, but also then to figure out what is needed, what are the gaps that can help us be the strongest possible for 2022.
So let me shift once again our focus, and I'd like to ask each of the panelists to weigh in on the question really of governance and decision making, particularly as it relates to an event that's so important to world sport, of course, the World Cup. So there's players and coaches, right? Critical components of any sporting event. And as this virus mutates, as it moves around the globe and wreaks havoc on sports, I think we almost have to be prepared for everything. As Mr. Montanari said, we need to really take a holistic approach. But ultimately, how do these decisions get made if there need to be changes, if decisions need to be made that are very significant, very impactful decisions, maybe about spectators and how many fans are allowed into the stands if we still need to socially distance. There are so many organizations that are engaged in putting on an event like this. You've got obviously FIFA, you've got the Qatar Football Association, and obviously the government, the WHO, the World Health Organizations, the confederations like UEFA or CONCACAF that have sent their teams to represent their respective regions around the world. National governing bodies like the English FA or the Deutsche Fußballbund. The players themselves. These players obviously are some of the most recognizable and iconic individuals on the planet because of the popularity of this sport. And they have professional careers to worry about as well as the honor of playing for their country. So I'm curious as to the decision-making process and the governance, because this is such a high-profile event with so many major institutions that are actively engaged. Mr. Montanari, if I could, I'll ask you your thoughts on this as well. You brought up, I think, an excellent point in terms of the idea of looking at these decisions in a much more holistic manner. So, Mr. Montanari, what are your thoughts on the governance and who ultimately should be able to make these decisions?
Well, it's not an easy question, I have to say. Perhaps if I can, I would mention two elements. One of more, let's say, philosophical nature, and one much more perhaps practical one. Starting from the first one, I see a need to have let's say, a strong alignment internationally on what are, let's say, the common values that we want to protect. Because as a matter of fact, we don't have in this moment, and probably we will not have an internationally binding instrument to orient decisions with regard to COVID-19 or the post-COVID scenarios. Because even if we look at all the work that was done by the WHO, which is how to say, outstanding, because since actually the day one, they start producing guidance, protocols, and models, and we had the privilege to be involved in such a process, which then kick off the nice and positive, let's say, domino effect, because now I would say every single sport federation, international, continental, or national, they have guidelines in place which mirrors, let's say, the model that has been developed by the WHO. But still, we are talking about instruments which are not binding in nature. So we don't have, let's say, a UN Security Council resolutions with regard to health. Okay, so we are, I think, operating in a sector in which I think we really need to find a common alignment on what we consider as a common good, and we probably need to refine a spirit also of international solidarity that will allow us to operate and to make decisions in line with a common, let's say, international vision. We are still a bit far from there because it requires, let's say, alignment on the macro, let's say, goals of the international communities. Whether you call these goals sustainable development goals, or you give them another names, but I believe that this should be, let's say, the cornerstone in order to have a real, let's say, and successful long-term approaches. If you really want to work on prevention and not simply on the reactions. Talking instead about much more, let's say, practical considerations, I would like to elaborate a bit on some of the intervention of Dr. Sorel before. Yes, it's true. I think we have now, let's say, a number of, let's say, guidelines and instruments which are available. I believe that what we need to do now is, of course, and also Dr. Justin mentioned that we need to test. So all the events which are now, let's say, in phase of planning and execution are and will be extremely precious in order to test the different models, whether in a full stadium capacity or reduce participation or without public. But most importantly, we will have to start comparing data regarding the different outcomes that these events will produce, because all in that way we will start understanding more regarding the measures that we are planning, imagining, and implementing.
Thank you. Major, given your role as a Security Committee member on the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, I would think that that entity as well will have a strong voice in terms of all the decisions that are made as we run up in the 2 years now to the World Cup, and perhaps even briefly before that. Major?
Yeah, honestly, my answer would be all of the above. And frankly speaking, it's feedback loop between the organizations that share the responsibility to deliver the world's greatest sporting event. No action should be taken from one organization alone, because this event involves everyone, and each entity can give important insights based on their experience and knowledge. For example, the government of Qatar and WHO can advise on policy. FIFA and the Qatar 2022 organizing committee advise on the implementation of those policies. Fans, broadcasters, and players can provide feedback on how such policies can affect them and so on.
Thank you. Before I jump to Dr. Kurland for his response, I will remind all of our listeners that a Q&A button is available to send your questions in. Dr. Kurland, please share your thoughts on the governance, if you will, and the decision-making tree that would be in place.
There's something going on outside my door. You might want to go to somebody else. You probably can't hear me.
Okay, we'll go to Dr. Sorel.
You know, I'm going to sound like a broken record here and agree with both of my colleagues that have spoken before. I think it's very much a group decision, a group effort, and all stakeholders need to be involved. there are disciplines and specialities that each entity can contribute to, and there needs to be open chains of communication as early as possible. And I think one of the other aspects is to think about not only operational risk communication within the organizing community and the stakeholders, but then also outreach to the public. Thinking about the risk communication, not only in terms of participation in person in stadiums, outside the stadiums, and just thinking about how to explain and communicate effectively the decisions that have been made so that the public can absorb, understand, and act appropriately.
Thank you. We'll return to Dr. Kurland after the construction project at the University of Southern Mississippi is over. Let me, if I could, add a couple of questions that came in from listeners for our panelists. Fatima wrote, and this is a question for Mr. Montanari. Fatima wrote, the discussion here has really been about professional sports and the World Cup, massive global events. But what about grassroots sport? What about sport at the very local level? Not for the profession, it's not on television, it's not being followed by billions of viewers. But Mr. Montanari, what about the effect right now that the COVID is having on grassroots sports?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, because this is a topic that is particularly close to my heart, and I'm sure that this is a topic that will be also very close to the heart of the overall international community, and very soon, because obviously, I mean, with the beginning of the COVID outbreak, all our attention went to the edge of the pyramid of sports. So we obviously look at the international federations, we look at the work of the big leagues, we look at, of course, at organizers of major sporting events. But of course, there is a huge and vast movement which is operating at the grassroots level, which needs and deserves to receive the same level of attention, or perhaps even more, because we are talking, when we're talking about the base of the pyramid, which is actually the base which is feeding the whole, let's say, sport system, and which obviously very often is at the same time also the less resourced, or often in many cases also managed by volunteers. So I believe that we really need to look at funding solutions as a matter of priority and urgencies to provide the necessary assistance and support to the grassroots level in order to properly, let's say, restart also grassroots sports in a regime of safety and security, also from a health perspective.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in from Justin, which I think follows on the back of Mr. Montanari's comments about amateur sport at the grassroots level. This was about college sports, which of course is amateur sport in the US. Justin writes, many families rely on sports scholarships to finance college educations. Do you think that in the short term, fewer sports in the US will be offering scholarships? And how about the long term? I'd be happy to weigh in on that as someone who's been involved with college athletics here in the United States. We've already seen, because of the pandemic, many athletic departments cut the number of sports, reduce the number of sports that they sponsor. In fact, one of our most prestigious universities in the United States, Stanford, out on the West Coast in California, dropped 11 of their sports, which has a serious impact on all those athletes, and very well could have an impact long term on the ability of the United States to produce Olympic athletes at the highest level. We have a much different sort of financing system for our Olympic athletes than most of the rest of the world. So I think the short answer, Justin, is that there very, very well will be, I think, additional athletic programs that drop certain sports from their repertoire, from their portfolio, if you will. And I think that will continue because primarily not so much of the COVID directly, but because of the financial impacts that the COVID is having. Dr. Sorrell, Georgetown is an excellent academic institution, but also a very good athletic institution, particularly historically with your basketball program. Do you have any thoughts at all on scholarships and how perhaps the economics of COVID and in the hit, if you will, that universities are taking may affect the athletic programs at schools?
You know, it's an interesting question. It's a very important question. I think athletics are part of the day-to-day operations of a university. It's part of school pride. It's part of, you know, being a student athlete. They contribute not only to their teams, to the university, as students, as alumni, and I think it's an important aspect to university systems. That being said, I think this is a subset of kind of a domino effect of what's happened because of this pandemic. We have, at least in the US and in many other countries, national pandemic preparedness plans that are sitting on shelves ready to be implemented. And a lot of times they don't necessarily involve after effects, hits to the economy, hits to jobs, academics, et cetera. And I think this is a wake-up call to public health experts, to global health security, policy individuals to understand and to continue to advocate for a interdisciplinary approach to policy and preparedness plans that involve not just public health, and to get sectors outside public health interested in these issues. I think we are going to see impacts across a variety of entities in academia be affected by this pandemic, not just this year, but for a number of years to come.
So another question that came in regards the sort of influence and guidance that some of the U.S. professional leagues may offer the rest of the world in terms of how they've set up these bubbles and have continued to compete, albeit without fans, spectators in the stadium. Should global sport look towards the U.S. as well as other nations, the various professional leagues, to sort of see what lessons have been learned and how those may be able to be applied as we go into hopefully a post-pandemic world? Obviously, the answer is yes, right? We should look at all of the professional and amateur organizations that are resuming competition to learn what lessons we have. I think, as we all know, Dr. Sorrell, this pandemic is hitting individual nations in different timing, and sport is such a regional and sometimes local event that it's important to learn those lessons. Jason from Edmonton writes from the hockey bubble that is taking place in Canada, and he says, are we learning anything from what's happening up in Canada? And I think the answer is yes as well. I mentioned the NBA and MLS, the WNBA, NWSL, but the NHL has done a remarkable job with its two bubbles. I think in Edmonton and I believe in Toronto is the second market. So let me ask this question to Mr. Montanari. Whose responsibility should it be to sort of monitor all the different experiments, if you will, that are taking place around the world, various sporting leagues, and trying to figure out how those could be implemented, come World Cup time? Mr. Montanari?
Yes, there are a number of mechanisms in place internationally, which are, let's say, bringing together knowledge, experiences, but also developing, let's say, new approaches. For instance, within the United Nations, you have a number of initiatives, and we are actually part of such programs like the UN Global Program on the Security of Major Sporting Events. There is also a program called International Permanent Observatory on the Security of Major Sporting Events, which has been established in 2006 by the ECOSOC. You have the Project Stadia, which is an initiative of Interpol. You have mechanism within the Council of Europe. So, and all these, let's say, initiatives are operating in synergy, so not, let's say, in duplication. So these are all, I would say, excellent opportunities, let's say, to avoid, let's say, reinventing the wheel. In addition to that, you have the knowledge transfer programs, which are managed by international sport federations like FIFA, IOC, UEFA. So I would say that nowadays you have, I would say, quite a clear and solid information exchange mechanism with regard to knowledge, approaches, practices, and tools, and approaches to several capacity building mechanisms, including those provided by the World Health Organization, but with regard to other threats, like for instance, CBRN, you have even the Atomic Agency, the OPCW. So I would say that all the key sectors are well covered by international organizations, international sport federations, and obviously by academia, you know, and we have actually here our hosts that are a very good example in this regard, or other initiatives like ISSS or other, let's say, international programs that could support such type of efforts.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions. One listener, VJ, writes, do you think there'll be a considerable drop in spectator numbers at future mega sporting events because of the COVID? That's a very fair question. I don't know, Dr. Kurland, if you are on and are able to weigh in, do you think there'll be a significant drop in spectator interest in terms of traveling to these mega events because of the concerns of COVID?
Sure. I think this is a great question, and it's probably $1 billion question, a multi-billion-dollar question, and it has to do in kind of trying to bring the various different things together that have been topics together that have been spoken about today. You know, what this really has been is a sort of experiment about the resiliency of sports and sports leagues and sports in our culture globally, more globally. And so, you know, we're seeing right now how resilient the sporting community and the entertainment communities really are as it relates to this. I suspect, in my own kind of feeling about what's going to happen, and this is just speculation, it's just my opinion, is that I do think that we're going to see a decrease. And I don't think that the decrease is happening solely because of COVID. I suspect that there's going to be a change that occurs over the next several years, in part because of other emerging technologies that make it possible for spectators to experience sport in new and different ways. In particular, I suspect that the rise of augmented reality and virtual reality, giving spectators the opportunity to experience games without some of the safety and security concerns associated with attending events, will probably begin to increase. And when these technologies really take fold and become part of the sports landscape in a much bigger way than they have at this point, I do anticipate the combination of COVID combined with various emerging technologies playing a big role in shaping a change as it relates to attendance. So I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I do think I've answered the question.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. One final question, which really is very pragmatic. So the NBA, with their successful and ongoing bubble, allegedly spent about $170 million to construct that bubble, if you will, right, with hotel costs and all the testing costs, et cetera. So is there any idea of what potentially an additional financial cost could be that would be obviously created in order to make sure that there is a very safe and healthy environment during the World Cup, or quite honestly any other mega event like the Olympics? Mr. Montanari, are you?
Yeah.
Look, what I would say in this regard, I believe that from a cost perspective, we really need to aim at optimizing as much as possible the resources available. So that means that in the future, any decision that will be related to health matters will also, given the relevance of the investments that will be done, we'll have to always to think on how such investment can have a positive impact also in other domains, including security. So at the same time, any other consideration will have to consider on how to benefit both health, safety, and security. For instance, in the past, I mean, until probably a few weeks ago, months ago, when we were building a new stadium, we were thinking, of course, about the security design. We were also thinking how to construct a new stadium that eventually can be utilized also for concerts or for other activities. Maybe in the future, we will have to construct and build new stadiums, thinking on how to eventually use them as a temporary hospital. So maybe as a temporary also venue and solution also to host eventually population escaping from humanitarian or natural disaster. So we really need to, I think, always to think in, as we said before, in holistic terms.
Yes, well, that's a great, I think, point to end on. We've reached our time limit. Let me thank Dr. Hall, Mr. Montanari, Major Alida, Dr. Sorrell, Dr. Kurland. Thank you so very much for taking your time and providing us this expertise. Let me thank the embassy for the work that you have done putting this together. But most importantly, thank you to all of the listeners who are around the globe interested, I am sure, in this topic. We appreciate it very much. So with that, we will sign off. Thank you again, and I wish everybody a great rest of the day.